Breaking news to bring you right now. Former U.S. President Jimmy Carter has died. Carter, a Southern Democrat, served as the 39th president from 1977 to 1981. The former Georgia governor and Nobel Prize winner had been battling cancer since 2015. The CBC's Lindsay Duncombe takes this look back at Carter's life.
In Jimmy Carter, the United States elected an outsider, plain-spoken, humble, religious.
I, Jimmy Carter, do solemnly swear.
The promise of his presidency a contrast to the scandal of the Nixon White House.
Let us create together a new national spirit of unity and trust.
Carter grew up on a peanut farm in rural Georgia. He served in the Navy before returning home to expand the family business. A Southern Democrat, as governor, he promoted civil rights and education. Carter aimed to achieve a competent and compassionate government, but his achievements were often overshadowed by a world in turmoil and a suffering economy. Carter embraced the role of peacemaker and focused his attention on the Middle East. The deal between Israel and Egypt, known as the Camp David Accords, solidified Carter's reputation as a statesman. It led to a Nobel Peace Prize. But it was the conflict with Iran that many say defined his presidency. In 1979, Islamic extremists overthrew the American-backed Shah. Iranian students took over the U.S. Embassy. 52 Americans were held hostage for more than a year. Carter ordered a high-risk rescue. It failed. 8 American servicemen were killed in a helicopter crash. The conflict with Iran led to a gas shortage, long lines and panic at the pump when Americans could least afford it. Inflation soared while wages stagnated.
It is a crisis of confidence.
In what's known as his malaise speech in 1979, Carter urged Americans to reduce consumption. He criticized self-indulgence and consumerism. It didn't go over well, especially in contrast to the telegenic Hollywood optimism of the man campaigning for Carter's job. Ronald Reagan would defeat Carter in 1980. Unpopular and just 56, Carter at first struggled with the adjustment to post-presidential life, but in the decades that followed, his public service would outshine his presidency. In 1982, he opened the Carter Center, devoted to peace and human rights. He and his wife Rosalind helped build homes all over the world through Habitat for Humanity. He authored dozens of books, including a fly fishing guide and a novel. His 2006 book, which compared Israeli actions in Gaza and the West Bank with South African apartheid, drew sharp criticism from fellow Democrats. He spoke to CBC about the controversy.
The word apartheid is provocative, but I don't look on the word provocative as negative.
In 2015, a devastating diagnosis. Carter had metastatic melanoma spread to his brain. A new drug regime put him in remission, and Carter continued to work into his 90s, traveling, building, preaching, living up to the title of his autobiography, A Good Life. Lindsay Duncombe, CBC News, Washington.
Journalist Steve Futterman is in Los Angeles, and he joins us with more on this. Steve, you have been in U.S. journalism for a long time. How do you think Americans are remembering Jimmy Carter today and the legacy that he leaves behind?
You know, it's going to be very interesting, Lindsay. Obviously, his presidency did not work out that well. He did have that really brief moment, shining moment of the Camp David Accords. He won the Nobel Peace Prize for that. But his presidency was marred, as Lindsay in her obit mentioned, about the Iran crisis, higher prices of gas, long lines of gasoline. It was a presidency which I think many people remember, if they're old enough to remember, sort of painful economic challenges. So I think they're going to remember both sides. But after he left office, he became a president that was so well respected. His work with Habitat for Humanity, charities, he worked with emerging democracies around the world. I even heard someone who never liked him as president say, he's our greatest former president. And this was someone who never voted for him either time and was very strongly against him, especially when he ran against Ronald Reagan. So I think he's going to be remembered in two different ways. The presidency, it's not going to be remembered as a great presidency, but I think afterwards, what he did, his accomplishments as a former president will be, I think, more warmly remembered by Americans and people around the world.
This is what I wanted to ask you next, Steve, and you already touched on that contrast between how he might have been perceived during his presidency and how he was perceived after, that some of the things he said that Lindsay mentioned in her obituary, things like that we're too focused on consumerism, seem to be well ahead of their time, decades ahead of their time. Some of the things we're still talking about to this day. You were working as a journalist at the time that he was in office, and then after he left office. What stood out to you about how this man was seen by American people?
Well, you can say things as president, and you can say things as a former president, and sometimes they're different things. As president, Americans did not want him to tell them there are things we can't do. But as a former president, he could take a step back and sort of tell Americans, well, this is something maybe we should think about, maybe consumerism. Remember, Lindsay mentioned the Malay speech. Well, that just did not go over well. Americans, I think most people, do not like to be told by their leaders, well, we can't do this, this, and this. And that's what the Malay speech largely did. But afterwards, as more of a statesman, as more of a philosopher, former president, he was able to talk about these things and not necessarily get rousing 100% approval for them, but it made people think. And when you're a former president, you can make people think a lot better than when you're a current president, and people don't want to hear these tough questions that you're asking. So I think these two sides of Jimmy Carter are going to be really part of his story. His rise to the presidency, though, Lindsay, was quite remarkable. There was a quiz show in the U.S., I think you've seen it in Canada, called What's My Line? And I think around a year before he got the nomination for president, he was the guest, and they didn't have to put the blindfolds on because they didn't know who he was. He was a guest, and they had to answer, what did you do? What is your claim to fame? And he stumped them. No one knew who Jimmy Carter was. And one of his favorite lines as he ran for president successfully in 1976 was to use that newcomer, unknown status. He would introduce himself at speeches. He would say, my name is Jimmy Carter, and I'm running for president. And even in his acceptance speech at the Democratic Convention, he used that line. It was a very interesting time. This was after the pardoning and the Watergate scandal, the pardoning of Richard Nixon by Gerald Ford. And many political scientists believe that race was quite close, by the way, in 76. Carter did defeat Gerald Ford. But many political scientists still believe that the pardoning of Nixon by Gerald Ford was the reason that Ford was not able to defeat Jimmy Carter. So lots of complications, it's a complicated story of Jimmy Carter, both in his rise to the presidency and afterwards.
While we still have you, Steve, I want to talk to you about his post-presidency work, all the charity work he did, the books he has written, which were impactful, in some cases controversial. I think many of us remember him in recent years going through therapy for cancer, having stitches on his eyebrows still, and yet working for Habitat for Humanity, really being dedicated to being a good neighbor and a good community person. Talk to me about how the post-presidency years and even just the last decade or last 2 decades have shaped his legacy on the global stage. When I talk to very young people, I was born during the Carter presidency, but people half my age, they seem to really have an admiration for him, even though they weren't around nowhere nearly for his presidency. Tell me about that part of his legacy, really the last 10, 20 years.
Well, I think when you talk about Habitat for Humanity, he is such a supporter of that group. He and Rosalind, his wife, when she was still alive, they would go to these towns, some big towns, some small towns, and they would work there. He'd be in his jeans, his work clothes, and they'd be hammering, helping build these homes, these projects. And it was something that you could tell he truly loved doing. He was a very religious man. We should point that out as well. He felt that you give back to people. He believed in the scripture. He talked about that often. And he was even a Sunday school teacher at one time. I think even after he was elected president during the transition period, I think he even taught, if my memory is correct, he even taught some Sunday school in Plains, Georgia, the town where he was from. Again, he was, as a former president, very well respected. Again, it didn't have to do with politics. It was what he was doing from his heart, to talk about charity, giving back to people. And that was something that resonated with people that may not resonate when you're a president. people don't want to hear about, as I mentioned before, giving back, dealing with difficulties. And when you're a former president, you can say these things, and they just have a different dynamic to them when you approach these subjects after you're president, rather than when you were president. So I think, again, in the end, he's going to be viewed as a president, not as successful, although he did have the Camp David Accords. As a former president, as a statesman, as a human being, I think he's going to be highly regarded by historians.
From a humble peanut farmer to,
Yes.
as you pointed out, Steve, maybe the greatest former president, who, of course, had such a long life and a long legacy that he leaves behind. Thank you so much for that, Steve.
Thank you very much, Deanna.
That was journalist Steve Futterman in Los Angeles.